In my years observing the rise and fall of governments, I have witnessed a singular truth: the moment abstract ideology replaces practical wisdom in governance, disaster follows as surely as night follows day. Today, as I watch political discourse reduced to rigid doctrines and theoretical purity, I am reminded of those fateful years when I witnessed the French revolutionaries tear down centuries of accumulated wisdom in pursuit of their geometric perfection. The same dangerous impulse, to remake society according to abstract principles rather than honor the tested wisdom of experience, threatens every free nation. The choice before us remains stark. We can either embrace the prudent path of gradual reform guided by historical experience, or surrender to the seductive but destructive allure of ideological certainty. What I learned through decades in Parliament about the true nature of good government may well determine whether your republic survives its current trials. Chapter 1: The Fatal Seduction of Abstract Principles. The most dangerous moment in any nation's life occurs when its leaders begin to believe that human society can be reconstructed according to abstract theories, divorced from the accumulated wisdom of generations. I have seen this fatal seduction at work, watching as intelligent men abandon the proven methods of constitutional governance for the glittering promises of ideological systems. The revolutionaries in France exemplified this destructive impulse perfectly. They possessed brilliant minds and sincere intentions, yet they committed the cardinal error of treating society as if it were a mathematical equation to be solved rather than a living organism to be carefully tended. They believed that by applying pure reason to human affairs, they could create a perfect state overnight. The result was not perfection but catastrophe, terror, violence, and the eventual rise of despotism. This same temptation appears in every generation, dressed in new garments but containing the same poisonous core. Whether it manifests as revolutionary socialism, anarchist libertarianism, or any other system that promises to solve human problems through rigid adherence to theoretical principles, the pattern remains consistent: initial enthusiasm, growing frustration with reality's resistance to theory, escalating coercion to force compliance, and final collapse into chaos or tyranny. The fundamental error lies in misunderstanding the nature of human society itself. Complex social arrangements cannot be designed like machines or proven like geometric theorems. They emerge through centuries of trial and error, incorporating the wisdom of countless generations who learned through bitter experience what works and what destroys. When we abandon this inherited wisdom for the latest theoretical fashion, we throw away humanity's most precious inheritance, the accumulated knowledge of how to live together in freedom and order. Good government requires not ideological purity but practical wisdom that respects both human nature and historical experience. The statesman's art lies in balancing competing claims, adjusting policies to circumstances, and preserving what has proven valuable while carefully reforming what has become obsolete. This delicate work cannot be reduced to simple formulas or abstract principles, no matter how intellectually appealing they may appear. The true conservative understands that society resembles a garden more than a laboratory. Like a skilled gardener, the prudent statesman works with natural growth patterns, pruning carefully and planting thoughtfully, always respecting the established ecosystem while gently encouraging beneficial development. The ideologist, by contrast, approaches society like a chemist mixing compounds, confident that the right formula will produce predictable results, regardless of existing conditions or human nature's stubborn realities. Chapter 2: How Revolutionary Madness Destroys Constitutional Order. The French Revolution provided the most instructive lesson in how ideological fervor dismantles the very foundations of civilized government. What began as reasonable demands for reform quickly transformed into a systematic assault on every institution that had maintained order and protected liberty for centuries. This transformation was not accidental, it was the inevitable result of substituting abstract rights for constitutional wisdom. The revolutionaries proclaimed universal principles that sounded magnificent in theory: absolute equality, unlimited freedom, perfect justice. Yet in practice, these abstract ideals became weapons against the complex arrangements that actually protect human dignity in real societies. They destroyed the intricate system of intermediate institutions, guilds, provincial assemblies, ecclesiastical organizations, that stood between the individual and the central power, leaving citizens naked before an increasingly despotic state. I watched in horror as they swept away legal traditions that had evolved over centuries to protect the innocent and ensure fair trials. They replaced judges trained in constitutional law with revolutionary tribunals guided only by ideological correctness. They abolished property rights that had provided security for families across generations, replacing them with arbitrary confiscations justified by theoretical equality. They even attempted to redesign the calendar itself, as if human nature and social rhythms could be reconstructed according to rational principles. Most tellingly, they destroyed the constitutional monarchy that had been gradually evolving toward greater liberty and justice. Instead of building upon existing institutions and reforming them prudently, they chose the path of total reconstruction. The result was not enhanced freedom but the terror, a period when abstract virtue became the justification for unprecedented tyranny. The contrast with England's constitutional development could not have been more stark. While France erupted in revolutionary violence, we in Britain had been gradually expanding liberty and reforming abuses through our ancient institutions. Our Constitution had no need for abstract declarations of rights because it embodied rights through concrete protections developed over centuries of struggle and compromise. We preserved what was valuable while carefully adjusting what required change. This difference in approach explains why the American Revolution succeeded while the French Revolution failed. The Americans drew upon English constitutional traditions, adapting proven principles to new circumstances rather than attempting to create an entirely new political system from abstract theories. They understood that lasting freedom requires solid institutional foundations, not merely inspiring declarations. The lesson remains painfully relevant today. Whenever political movements promise to solve complex problems through rigid adherence to ideological principles, whether those principles emerge from left or right, they threaten the constitutional order that protects genuine liberty. The preservation of free government requires not revolutionary enthusiasm but constitutional wisdom that respects the delicate balance between authority and freedom that has been achieved through centuries of careful development. Chapter 3: The Illusion of Representation Without Practical Wisdom. One of the most dangerous errors that ideological thinking introduces into government is the reduction of representation to mere mechanical reflection of popular will. This misunderstanding threatens the very foundation of responsible government and reveals how abstract theories about democracy can destroy the substance of democratic governance. During my years in Parliament, I learned that true representation involves far more than simply counting votes or following the loudest voices in society. The representative who serves his constituents well must sometimes oppose their immediate desires in order to protect their deeper interests. He must possess the wisdom to distinguish between the passing enthusiasm of the moment and the enduring welfare of the community. This delicate balance requires practical judgment that cannot be reduced to simple formulas about popular sovereignty. The ideological approach to representation treats the people as if they were always perfectly informed about complex issues and invariably wise in their immediate judgments. This flattering but false assumption leads to demagogic government where leaders compete to promise whatever the crowd demands rather than providing the thoughtful leadership that difficult times require. Such an approach transforms representatives from statesmen into mere delegates, bound to execute the will of their constituents regardless of their own knowledge and judgment. Consider how this plays out in practice. When complex economic policies must be formulated, should representatives simply poll their districts and vote accordingly? When international crises require nuanced responses based on confidential information, should foreign policy be determined by popular referendum? When constitutional questions arise that require deep understanding of legal precedents and institutional relationships, should such matters be settled by immediate democratic vote? The absurdity of such an approach becomes clear when we recognize that effective governance requires specialized knowledge, careful deliberation, and the ability to consider long-term consequences that may not be immediately apparent to the general public. The people, in their collective wisdom, choose representatives precisely because they trust their judgment to navigate complexities that cannot be reduced to simple yes or no questions. This is what I meant when I argued that Parliament is a deliberative assembly, not a congress of ambassadors from different localities bound by rigid instructions. Representatives must certainly remain connected to their constituents and accountable for their decisions, but they must also exercise independent judgment based on the fuller picture that their position provides. They serve the interests of their districts best when they contribute their knowledge and experience to the common deliberation rather than simply echoing whatever opinion happens to be popular at the moment. The ideological corruption of this principle appears whenever political movements demand that representatives conform to theoretical purity rather than practical wisdom. Whether the ideology comes from left or right, the result is the same: the replacement of thoughtful deliberation with rigid adherence to abstract principles, the substitution of symbolic politics for effective governance, and the gradual erosion of the institutional culture that makes parliamentary government possible. True representation requires both democratic legitimacy and practical wisdom. Representatives must be accountable to the people while remaining free to exercise their judgment in the people's service. This balance cannot be achieved through ideological formulas but only through the patient cultivation of constitutional traditions that honor both popular government and responsible leadership. Chapter 4: Political Economy versus Economic Ideology. The proper relationship between government and economic life provides perhaps the clearest illustration of how ideological thinking destroys practical wisdom in governance. Throughout my parliamentary career, I observed how both excessive intervention and doctrinaire laissez-faire approaches fail to serve the genuine interests of society when pursued as rigid ideologies rather than flexible principles adapted to circumstances. The science of political economy cannot be reduced to simple formulas about free markets or state control. Real economic policy must consider the complex interplay between individual liberty, social stability, traditional arrangements, and the moral foundations that make commercial society possible. When ideologues treat economic questions as if they could be solved through pure theory, they invariably create more problems than they solve. I witnessed this firsthand during our struggles with colonial taxation policy. The rigid application of abstract principles about sovereignty and taxation led us to impose burdens on the American colonies that violated both prudent policy and natural justice. A more practical approach would have recognized that different circumstances require different arrangements, and that the preservation of imperial unity required flexibility rather than theoretical consistency. The same error appears whenever governments attempt to reshape economic life according to ideological blueprints. Revolutionary regimes typically begin by declaring that they will eliminate inequality or create perfect competition through systematic intervention. They ignore the reality that economic arrangements grow organically from countless individual decisions and cultural traditions that cannot be redesigned like mechanical systems. Yet the opposite extreme proves equally destructive. When market ideology becomes a rigid dogma that ignores social responsibilities and moral considerations, it produces its own form of revolutionary disruption. The belief that markets automatically produce optimal outcomes regardless of cultural context or institutional framework represents the same kind of abstract thinking that characterizes revolutionary ideology. It substitutes theoretical elegance for practical wisdom. Prudent economic governance requires understanding that markets operate within social and moral frameworks that must be carefully maintained. Property rights, for instance, cannot be justified merely as efficient allocations of resources, they must be understood as social institutions that carry moral obligations and contribute to the overall health of the community. The property owner serves not only his own interests but acts as a trustee of resources that affect the welfare of society. This means that economic policy must consider not only efficiency but also justice, stability, and the preservation of social bonds that make commercial cooperation possible. Sometimes this requires gentle intervention to prevent abuses or assist those whom economic change has displaced. Other times it demands resistance to popular demands for redistribution that would undermine the incentives and institutions upon which prosperity depends. The art of political economy lies in navigating these competing considerations without falling into ideological extremes. This requires statesmen who understand both the benefits of economic freedom and the social conditions necessary to sustain it. They must be willing to defend property rights against populist attacks while also ensuring that economic power serves rather than threatens the common good. Such nuanced governance cannot be achieved through rigid adherence to either socialist or libertarian ideology. It requires the practical wisdom that recognizes economic life as one dimension of human society that must be harmonized with other important values through patient, case-by-case adjustment rather than systematic theoretical reconstruction. Chapter 5: The Role of Moral Tradition in Preventing Ideological Extremism. The most effective barrier against ideological extremism in government has always been a strong foundation of shared moral principles rooted in religious tradition and cultural inheritance. When societies lose this moral ballast, they become vulnerable to every theoretical wind that promises to solve human problems through political means alone. The preservation of free government therefore requires not just constitutional arrangements but the cultural foundations that sustain constitutional wisdom. Throughout my observations of political upheaval, I have noted that ideological movements typically begin by attacking the moral and religious traditions that provide society's ethical framework. This is not accidental. Established moral order represents the greatest obstacle to revolutionary reconstruction because it insists that human nature and social relationships cannot be remade according to abstract theories. The French revolutionaries understood this perfectly. They could not implement their geometric vision of society while traditional Christianity continued to teach that human beings possess inherent dignity, that authority comes from God rather than human will, and that social institutions develop organically rather than through rational design. They therefore launched a systematic assault on the Church, attempting to replace Christian faith with a civil religion based on revolutionary principles. The result was moral chaos that made political tyranny inevitable. When people lose their sense of transcendent truth and moral obligation, they become susceptible to whatever ideology promises to fill the spiritual vacuum. Political movements that would have been recognized as dangerous fanaticism in a morally grounded society suddenly appear reasonable to people who have been cut loose from their traditional moorings. This is why established religion plays such a crucial role in maintaining free government. Not because any particular denomination must dominate political life, but because religious tradition provides the moral foundation that prevents politics from becoming a total ideology. When people understand that their ultimate allegiance belongs to God rather than the state, they maintain the critical distance necessary to evaluate political claims and resist totalitarian temptations. The American founders understood this principle clearly. Their system of government assumed a religiously informed citizenry that would bring moral judgment to political questions rather than expecting politics to provide moral guidance. They separated church and state institutionally while recognizing that both depended upon shared moral convictions rooted in religious tradition. This balance becomes impossible when societies embrace ideological secularism that treats religious conviction as purely private opinion with no public relevance. Such an approach creates a moral vacuum that ideological movements rush to fill, promising secular salvation through political action. Whether the ideology emphasizes individual rights or collective welfare, it inevitably expands to claim authority over questions that properly belong to moral and religious discourse. The antidote to this dangerous development is not theocratic government but the revival of moral seriousness that recognizes political questions as part of a larger framework of human obligation and divine purpose. This requires religious communities that engage thoughtfully with public questions while maintaining their independence from political power, and political leaders who understand that their authority is limited by moral principles that transcend partisan advantage. A society grounded in such moral tradition develops natural resistance to ideological extremism because its members possess standards for evaluating political claims that come from sources deeper than immediate self-interest or theoretical appeal. They can distinguish between legitimate governance and totalitarian overreach because they understand that human dignity and social order depend upon realities that no political system can create or destroy. Chapter 6: Federal Wisdom versus Centralized Ideology. The tension between federal governance and centralized control illuminates another crucial dimension of how ideological thinking threatens constitutional government. Throughout my experience with imperial administration and colonial relations, I learned that the attempt to impose uniform principles across diverse communities invariably produces more conflict than it resolves. Yet ideological movements consistently promise that their theories can eliminate such conflicts through systematic centralization. The genius of federal arrangements lies in their recognition that different communities may require different approaches to common problems while still maintaining unity in essential matters. This principle acknowledges the complexity of human society and the wisdom of allowing local variation within a shared constitutional framework. It represents the opposite of ideological thinking, which insists that correct principles must be applied uniformly regardless of local circumstances or cultural differences. My observations of our colonial difficulties taught me that the preservation of imperial unity required respect for local autonomy rather than rigid enforcement of abstract sovereignty. The American colonists possessed legitimate traditions of self-governance that had developed over generations to suit their particular circumstances. When we attempted to impose uniform taxation and administration according to theoretical principles about parliamentary supremacy, we destroyed the practical arrangements that had maintained both imperial unity and colonial liberty. The same error appears whenever central governments attempt to solve local problems through ideological programs that ignore regional differences and community traditions. Whether the ideology emphasizes equality, efficiency, or any other abstract principle, the result is typically the destruction of local arrangements that had evolved to handle specific circumstances in favor of uniform systems that serve no community well. Consider how this dynamic operates in contemporary federal systems. Ideological movements consistently push for national solutions to problems that might be better addressed at state or local levels, not because such centralization serves practical purposes but because it allows for the systematic implementation of theoretical principles. They treat diversity in policy approaches as a problem to be solved rather than a strength to be preserved. The federal principle recognizes that genuine unity requires respect for legitimate diversity. Communities can share fundamental constitutional principles while maintaining different approaches to education, economic regulation, social policy, and countless other matters. This arrangement allows for beneficial experimentation and adaptation while preventing any single approach from dominating all others. Such wisdom cannot emerge from ideological thinking because ideology demands consistency and systematic implementation. The ideologist sees variations in policy as evidence of error or injustice that must be corrected through centralized control. He cannot appreciate that the same constitutional principles might justify different practical arrangements in different circumstances. The preservation of federal governance therefore requires constant vigilance against ideological movements that promise to solve complex problems through uniform national policies. Whether such movements come from left or right, they threaten the balance between unity and diversity that makes federal systems both stable and free. This principle applies not only to domestic governance but to international relations as well. The attempt to impose ideological systems on other nations, whether democratic capitalism, socialist equality, or any other theoretical arrangement, typically produces resistance and conflict rather than the promised benefits. Prudent international policy recognizes that different societies may develop different approaches to legitimate governance while still maintaining peaceful and productive relationships. The alternative to ideological centralization is not chaos or fragmentation but the patient cultivation of federal wisdom that respects both shared principles and local variation. This requires statesmen who understand that constitutional unity can accommodate considerable diversity, and citizens who appreciate that their own liberty depends partly upon respecting the liberty of other communities to arrange their affairs differently within common constitutional bounds. Chapter 7: Applying Burkean Prudence to Contemporary American Governance. The application of conservative prudence to contemporary American governance requires understanding how the principles I developed through parliamentary experience can guide political judgment in your particular constitutional context. The genius of the American system lies in its combination of federal structure, separation of powers, and respect for traditional liberties, arrangements that embody the kind of practical wisdom I always advocated. Yet these same institutions face constant pressure from ideological movements that would reshape them according to abstract theories. Your constitutional tradition represents perhaps the most successful example of prudent revolution in human history. The founders drew upon English constitutional experience while adapting proven principles to American circumstances. They created innovations like written constitutionalism and formal separation of powers while preserving essential elements like representative government, common law traditions, and federalism. This approach exemplifies the conservative method of building upon tested foundations rather than attempting total reconstruction. Yet contemporary American politics increasingly suffers from the same ideological corruption that I witnessed in other contexts. Both progressive movements that promise to solve social problems through expanded government and libertarian movements that treat limited government as an abstract principle rather than a practical arrangement fall into the trap of substituting theory for wisdom. The progressive impulse to address every social problem through federal legislation ignores the constitutional wisdom of federalism and the practical reality that centralized solutions often create more problems than they solve. When activists demand national policies on education, healthcare, housing, and countless other matters, they typically justify their demands through abstract appeals to equality or rights rather than careful analysis of what approaches work best in practice. Similarly, when libertarian movements treat constitutional limitations as absolute prohibitions rather than prudential guidelines, they ignore the reality that effective governance requires flexibility and adaptation to circumstances. The Constitution provides a framework for decision-making, not a detailed blueprint that can be applied mechanically to every situation. The conservative approach recognizes that American institutions work best when they operate according to their designed purposes rather than being stretched to serve ideological goals. Congress functions most effectively when it focuses on genuinely national concerns rather than attempting to micromanage local affairs. The presidency serves the country well when it provides energetic execution of the laws rather than trying to become a national patriarch who solves every social problem. The courts protect liberty most reliably when they interpret law according to established principles rather than imposing policy preferences disguised as constitutional interpretation. This means that contemporary American conservatism should focus on preserving and strengthening institutions rather than pursuing ideological purity. It should defend federalism not as an abstract principle but as a practical arrangement that allows for beneficial diversity and prevents dangerous concentration of power. It should support traditional arrangements like marriage, local community institutions, and religious liberty not merely because they are old but because they serve essential human needs that political institutions cannot replace. The cultivation of civic virtue remains as important in America as it was in 18th century Britain. Citizens who understand their responsibilities as well as their rights, who appreciate the complexity of governance, and who judge political proposals by their practical effects rather than their theoretical appeal provide the foundation upon which constitutional government depends. This requires educational institutions that teach appreciation for inherited wisdom rather than just critical thinking, religious communities that engage seriously with public questions while maintaining their independence from political power, and political leaders who understand themselves as trustees of institutional health rather than agents of ideological transformation. The path forward for American governance lies not in revolutionary change but in the patient work of institutional renewal guided by constitutional wisdom. This means reforming what requires improvement while carefully preserving what has proven valuable, always remembering that the ultimate test of political arrangements is not their conformity to abstract principles but their success in protecting human dignity and promoting genuine flourishing. Conclusion. The central lesson of my political experience remains as relevant today as when I first learned it through parliamentary struggle. Ideology is the enemy of good government because it substitutes abstract theory for practical wisdom. Whether it appears as revolutionary radicalism or doctrinaire conservatism, ideological thinking destroys the delicate balance of considerations that effective governance requires. The alternative is not unprincipled pragmatism but prudential judgment that honors both enduring principles and particular circumstances. This approach recognizes that human society cannot be perfected through political means but can be gradually improved through careful attention to what works and what destroys. It values tradition not as blind prejudice but as accumulated wisdom, supports reform not as systematic reconstruction but as organic development guided by experience. Your American Republic possesses institutional arrangements that embody this kind of practical wisdom, but they require constant cultivation by citizens who understand that freedom depends upon more than constitutional texts. It requires the civic virtues and cultural foundations that make constitutional government possible. The choice before you mirrors what every generation faces. You can choose the patient path of preserving and improving your inheritance, or surrender to the fatal attraction of ideological solutions that promise everything and deliver only chaos.